January 1945. The Ardennes forest was a landscape of frozen pine and shattered steel, where the temperature had plummeted to minus 15 degrees Celsius. In the chaos of the German retreat, a medical convoy from the 12th Evacuation Hospital vanished near the village of Houffalize. Among the missing were 5 American nurses. For weeks their fate was unknown, until the 4th Armored Division breached the gates of a secluded manor house. Inside, they didn't find a battlefield, but a scene of calculated depravity. Sturmbannführer Klaus Richter had transformed a private estate into a fortress where the laws of the Geneva Convention ceased to exist. When General George S. Patton arrived on the scene, he didn't just see a military objective. He saw a fundamental breach of the warrior's code. Inside, they finally found the nurses. They were alive, but barely holding on. There were no signs of a fight and no resistance. The silence inside the house made it clear that everything had been done on purpose. Richter had not treated them as prisoners of war. He kept them there for himself. For weeks, this house was not a command post. It became a place where power replaced rules, and no one came to stop it. When Patton walked in, he did not speak, and he did not ask questions. He looked at the nurses and then at the man responsible. In that moment, something changed. For him, this was no longer just war. To understand the scene Patton encountered, we must look at the specific reality of the 12th Evacuation Hospital. These units were the backbone of the Third Army's survival, operating in tents and requisitioned buildings just miles from the heavy artillery thunder. The capture of 5 nurses wasn't just a loss of medical staff. It was a devastating assault on the moral compass of every American soldier in the sector. When Patton entered the manor, the air inside was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and coal smoke, a jarring, sickening contrast to the frozen rot and death outside. He found Richter sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, still maintaining the facade of a refined elite officer of the Third Reich. Richter believed his rank was his absolute armor. He cited the Hague Convention with a smug grin, expecting to be treated as a guest of honor in an officer's POW camp, where he could sit out the war with stolen books and fine cognac. But as Patton looked past the officer, he saw the 5 nurses standing in the dim, flickering light of the hallway. They were skeletal, their eyes filled with a hollow, haunting trauma that no military report could ever fully capture. Richter had treated them not as captives, but as domestic servants for his personal amusement, attempting to turn American officers into trophies of his collapsing empire. This wasn't just a violation of rules. It was a systematic violation of the human soul. Patton, who carried his ivory-handled revolvers as holy symbols of a bygone era of chivalry, felt a fury that was quiet, cold, and utterly lethal. He realized that a standard court-martial would take months of bureaucratic delays, offering Richter a public platform to defend his so-called honor. Patton decided right then and there that Richter's honor would be the first thing to die in that Belgian courtyard. Ask yourself, if you were standing there in the mud, seeing the hollow eyes of those women, would you wait for a lawyer, or would you demand justice right now? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Patton ordered the military police of the 503rd MP Battalion to drag Richter out into the freezing, gray mud of the courtyard. He didn't want the major to dig trenches or haul heavy supplies. He wanted something far more permanent, something that would scar the man's soul forever. He ordered his entire command staff and the 5 rescued nurses to assemble in a silent circle. In front of his battle-hardened troops, Patton reached into his kit and handed a pair of heavy industrial shears to the lead nurse, Lieutenant Mary Sullivan. He gave a command that chilled the hearts of everyone present. He tried to strip you of your dignity. Now you will strip him of his identity. Under Patton's direct, unblinking supervision, the nurses were ordered to systematically cut the symbols of rank from Richter's uniform while he was still wearing it. The Iron Cross, the SS runes, and the silver shoulder straps were severed one by one and allowed to fall into the frozen muck of the Belgian earth. Richter began to scream, citing his officer's rights under international law, but Patton stood just inches from his face, his eyes like polished, frozen stone. You lost your rights as a soldier the moment you treated American officers like your personal servants, Patton growled, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of military history. But the ritual wasn't over. Patton then forced Richter to go down on his knees and with his bare hands dig a shallow hole in the ice-hardened ground. He made Richter bury his own medals, the very symbols of the genocidal ideology that had fueled his cruelty. This wasn't just a physical punishment. It was a ritual of total psychological destruction. Patton realized that for these 5 women to even begin the agonizing process of healing, they needed to see the man who had terrified them reduced to a shivering, pathetic, and nameless figure in the dirt. Patton's decision to humiliate Richter was as cold and strategic as it was personal. He understood a fundamental truth about the Nazi officer corps. They operated on a currency of prestige, arrogance, and perceived genetic superiority. By allowing the nurses to physically and symbolically dismantle Richter's military identity in front of his former subordinates and the local Belgian civilians, Patton was effectively de-weaponizing the SS myth in that entire sector. If he had followed the official protocol, Richter would have remained a noble prisoner, maintaining his status and his ego even behind American barbed wire. He would have held court in a POW camp, telling stories of his valor. But Patton chose to break the man's spirit, replacing his aura of defiance with a stench of absolute failure that no one wanted to be associated with. The professional risks were immense. Generals like Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower were already under massive political pressure from Washington and the international press to ensure the Third Army adhered strictly to the letter of the law. A formal complaint from the International Red Cross about the systematic mistreatment of a high-ranking officer could have reached the desk of General Marshall, potentially stripping Patton of his stars and his command. Patton knew that his enemies in the Pentagon were waiting for him to trip, to make one mistake that would allow them to sideline him forever. But Patton operated on a frequency that bypassed bureaucracy. In his private diary, he noted, "The only way to win a lasting peace with these people is to make them fear the consequences of their arrogance more than they fear death itself. A dead enemy is a memory. A humiliated enemy is a lesson that keeps the peace for generations." This incident sent a shockwave through the retreating German lines, communicating a terrifying new reality. The Americans were no longer interested in the polite, aristocratic rules of European warfare when it came to those who crossed the line of basic human decency. Patton proved that the most powerful weapon in the Third Army's arsenal wasn't the 75mm gun on a Sherman tank. It was the absolute destruction of the Nazi ego. Klaus Richter was eventually transported to a POW facility deeper in the rear, but he arrived as a hollowed-out man without a soul. He had been stripped of his stars, his medals, and the very foundation of his identity in front of those he deemed inferior. To the German soldiers in the transport, he was no longer a leader, he was a warning. Official U.S. Army records regarding his final disposition are intentionally vague, often listing him simply as transferred for interrogation, before he vanished entirely from the historical archives. Some say he died in captivity, Others believe he was handed over to the local authorities who had their own scores to settle. Regardless of his physical end, Patton ensured that the specific details of this court of honor were scrubbed from the press briefings of 1945. He understood that the American public wasn't ready to see their hero general allowing such raw, personal, and primitive justice. However, for the 5 nurses of the 12th Evacuation Hospital, the lesson was permanent. They were eventually awarded the Bronze Star for their endurance under capture, but their true restoration didn't happen in a medal ceremony at a rear headquarters. It happened in that frozen courtyard, watching their tormentor crumble in the mud at their feet. Patton didn't just win a tactical battle that day. He defined the moral boundaries of the American occupation of Germany. He proved that even in the midst of total war, there are crimes so heinous they demand a justice that the law books haven't even written yet. Today, we remember Patton for his sweeping armored thrusts across France, his ivory-handled revolvers, and his colorful speeches. But behind the legend of old blood and guts was a man who understood the weight of silent, personal justice. He didn't just liberate 5 women. He ensured that the stain on the reputation of the SS elite would be permanent, proving that the greatest weapon against arrogance is not a bomb, but the truth stripped bare in the dirt. He taught the world that while war is a clash of steel, the real victory is the survival of human dignity in the face of absolute darkness. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of World War II's most guarded personal stories. This case remains a testament to the iron will of George S. Patton and his refusal to tolerate the corruption of military honor. If you want to see more untold truths and psychological profiles from the battlefields of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications so you never miss an investigation. Leave a comment below. Was Patton a visionary of justice or a man who became what he hated? Your support helps us keep these stories alive and ensures that the lessons of the past are never forgotten.
Thank you for watching. This was Mike. I appreciate your time. See you in the next video.